morning, Dan and Amy, and the new information that became available after our show yesterday about the Manchester bombing and the Manchester bomber. He's been identified. His family apparently helped in terms of identifying him, turning him into authorities effectively. He, 23-year-old Libyan national. He was on the radar of British intelligence, but they didn't believe that he presented a security threat. There are definitive links to al-Qaeda, and through his travels over the last year, there's the supposition that he could have made connection with other terrorist organizations in addition to al-Qaeda. And there's been a lot of criticism of British politicians, even as they announced yesterday that their alert level is at its highest because they believe, based on intelligence, they're susceptible to another imminent terrorist attack.
Yeah, they said it's not if, it's when. And David Ross from ABC News did a great job. He's in Manchester, and he interviewed
Brian Ross,
David
Ross is a catcher for the Cubs who finished second in Dancing with the Stars.
I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong thing. And he interviewed Mohammed Saeed. He's the imam, and he said that in 2015 he gave a sermon in which he criticized ISIS. And that is when, I don't even want to pronounce his name, the monster, the terrorist, said that he was showing me so much hate. He hated me, basically. I was shocked. And because I was saying that we should protect innocent lives, and he got up and he stormed out. Now, shouldn't he have done something to alert authorities, say, hey, this guy isn't right? I mean, why they need to police their own and turn in their own.
And, as much as that's certainly an issue that needs to be discussed, as well as how we talk about this, the dialogue. It's interesting. Fareed Zakaria gave Trump high marks for his textured speech in Saudi Arabia on the issue of radical Islamic terrorism. And there's some criticism being directed at Paul's, as I mentioned, in Britain today. Morrissey, who's was born in Manchester, of course, the front man for the Smiths. Mm-hmm. He posted a rather trenchant critique. In modern Britain, everyone seems petrified to officially say what we all say in private. Politicians tell us they are unafraid, but they are never the victims. How easy to be unafraid when one is protected from the line of fire. The people have no such protections. It could be applied to the Pauls in Chicago, too, that criticism. He goes on to say, in criticism of those who describe the bomber as a quote-unquote extremist, this is the best part. Morrissey asks, an extreme what? An extreme rabbit? The suspension of disbelief. No more for one Manchester-born singer. What about the rest of Western Europe? For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Colonel Cedric Leighton, who's a military intelligence expert, security consultant who served both on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as the National Security Council. Colonel Leighton, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
You bet, Dan. Good to be with you.
So what about the issue of 3,500 identified terrorists, according to press reports, suspected terrorists in Britain that intelligence is trying to keep track of? We've got a similar dynamic in this country with the reports of the FBI involved in terrorist organization investigations in all 50 states. Is there more that could and should be done by Western intelligence agencies and law enforcement, whether it's in the UK or here, that isn't being done?
Well, I think there always is more that can be done. I mean, they're beginning to look at using more modern technologies, things like artificial intelligence, data mining. The NSA and other intelligence agencies have done a very good job of starting some of the processes of data mining, for example, in the intelligence world. But that's the kind of thing that you need. If you have that volume of terrorists, the 3,500 alleged to be in the UK and all 50 states being sites of some kind of terrorism investigation in the U.S., it's very clear that the numbers are high enough that you can't have old methods in place. You can't, do the old gumshoe routine that we're all familiar with from the movies, because that just isn't sufficient. There are so many ways that people can get radicalized, and to keep on top of that, to understand what they're going through, to pick up on nuances like his reaction to the imam, the suspect's reaction to the imam that you talked about in the UK. All of that is very, very important. And at some point you want to get to the point where you actually anticipate these kinds of acts and prevent them from happening. That's probably a bridge too far for a long, long time, but that's the kind of thing that you want to get at, and you want to be able to have the security services do that.
Well, Salman Abedi, he was born in the UK, but he was the son of a family who immigrated from Libya, recently traveled there. Is there a large ISIS population, or is that a hotbed of ISIS activity in Libya?
It is, Amy, and what ISIS is doing is basically they are moving their people, or have tried to move their people from Iraq and Syria, as a lot of pressure mounts against their strongholds in western Mosul, and of course in Raqqa, their up to this point de facto capital. They're moving their people, and have done so for several months now, to Libya as best as they can. And the fact that Libya is also, in essence, ungoverned territory, there are different competing factions there, makes it a very good, fertile ground for ISIS to grow. And ISIS has been very active, especially in some of the coastal areas. The town of Sirte, for example, has been one of the big hotbeds of ISIS activity in the past. And that's the kind of thing that makes it highly likely that that Salman was actually the person, one of the persons that was trained in Libya by ISIS, and possibly used that training as he detonated his device in Manchester.
I know all of these incidents and individuals are case specific, but is there any established protocol or checklist or approach that's taken by intelligence to rank, order, prioritize all of these investigations and all of these potential threats? I mean, I know you talked about using AI and algorithmic solutions to help do the analysis, but ultimately you're going to have some human judgment calls. And is there such a practicum in place that is used by intelligence officers and law enforcement?
Yes, there is. And, for example, we take the British equivalent of the FBI, MI5, Scotland Yard. They have a series of protocols that they use where they look at a person's patterns of behavior, and the FBI does it in a similar fashion, where you see where a person has traveled. You find out who they're connected to. Unfortunately, we do a lot of the analysis after the fact, after a tragedy like Manchester has happened. But there are ways, of course, to look at that. What becomes critical in this is the type of border controls that these countries have. Can they track people's travel? Do they understand, where they, not only where they went, but how they got there? So in the case of ISIS, for example, in the past it was always clear that they went through Turkey to get to Syria. That kind of pattern of behavior, and the fact that he went to Libya, that becomes a key indicator, and should have served as a red flag, or at least one of a series of red flags that would have indicated a degree of radicalization and possible training in this particular case.
So in the UK now, in Manchester, they're adding 3,000 more military personnel to get, to guard soft targets such as shopping malls, arenas, things like that, concerts. Is that going to help, or is that just window dressing?
Well, sometimes window dressing, and it is to an extent window dressing, Amy, but sometimes window dressing can have a deterrent effect. After the Paris attacks, the French deployed even more troops in Paris, so you can make the argument that, well, they already had troops there, and the attacks on the Bataclan still happened. But what does happen on occasion is that some terrorists get cold feet when they see soldiers, with their submachine guns standing guard in front of monuments or even soft targets. So there is some degree of a deterrent effect. but it is not sufficient to prevent the kinds of things that, such as the Manchester attack, that could have a significant impact not only on the specific people involved, but on society at large. So it's window dressing after the fact, and unfortunately, it's a very reactive posture. Not that you can blame them for doing it, but the fact of the matter is, it's less effective than one would hope.
I wanted to get your reaction on another subject, to the testimony before the House Intelligence Committee from former CIA Director John Brennan yesterday, in which he basically said, look, we observed some contacts that I'm not going to describe in any greater detail because it's classified information, so I'm not going to describe that in open session. But we observed some contacts between the Trump organization and Russians, and they were concerning. I don't know the nature of those contacts, whether they were benign or not benign, to borrow the characterization from Trey Gowdy. And it's not our job at CIA to judge guilt or innocence on anything. We refer to the FBI for investigation, which they did, and this has been going on for 10 months. Krauthammer yesterday on Fox said basically, the thing is no one has pointed to a there on this Russian collusion story. And the real reason it's being fueled, in addition to the perspective of the D.C. press corps, is by President Trump, who acts like there's a there with some of his offhanded comments to various personnel and in myriad meetings. What is your assessment as somebody who's steeped in military intelligence, worked at the Joint Chiefs, worked at the National Security Council, about this Russian collusion, Russian interference with the investigation, all of the allegations that are swirling around Trump and the Trump administration?
Well, I certainly think that there are some issues there. So the characterization that John Brennan made in front of the committees in Congress yesterday was very interesting, because what it did was it provided a window on how in these types of cases intelligence agencies operate. And he was absolutely correct that when the intelligence agencies look at something like this, they operate on the principle of suspicion. If there is contact, you want to know, is this contact something that is just happening in the normal course of business, or is there something more sinister going on? So when somebody like Mr. Brennan looks at this, and myself included, you look at these kinds of things and you say, okay, what is the pattern here? Is this, did they just bump into each other at the cocktail party, or is a type of relationship being cultivated? And it's pretty clear from what has been released so far that the Russians did, in fact, try to cultivate some degree of a relationship. Now, it could be, that they want to sell more oil to the United States, and that's a fairly benign activity. But when you work in an intelligence agency, you're looking for more suspicious, more sinister things, and you are going to not only look at the type of contact, but the frequency of contact, and actually who made that contact, who was in this. So when you look at the situation with retired General Michael Flynn, you see that there was direct contact with the Russian ambassador to the United States, Mr. Kislyak. And when you see that, that's a very high level. It's at the beginning, at least, a bit unusual, when he became the national security advisor, or the senior advisor for national security affairs in the transition team. Then it, was somewhat normal to have that kind of contact. But the fact that it existed before anybody knew he was going to be in that role, that indicates, that there's some degree of suspicion, just as an example. So when you look at this, you look at, what's the possibility of things going really bad? What's the possibility of the Russians orchestrating some kind of a campaign to turn people to be working on their behalf? And when John Brennan talked about people being witting accomplices and unwitting accomplices in this kind of activity, that's exactly right. There are a lot of people who are contacted by intelligence agencies from foreign countries, and those intelligence agencies want to get information out of them. And in some cases, they don't even reveal their hand. They make the people do their bidding in a very subtle way. They get what they need out of them, and there's no real further contact. In other cases, they want to cultivate the contact, and they want to make that contact even more robust. And in some cases, they then actually do make them engage in treasonous activities, and that's because of financial connections that develop. It's because of they do one favor for them, and then you heap that onto another favor, and then that results in the prospect of forcing them to betray their country. Not saying that this has happened in this case; it's way too early for that. But that's the kind of behavior that intelligence agents engage in, and it's certainly something that the Russians have practiced for many, many, many years.
He is Colonel Cedric Leighton, military intelligence expert, security consultant, who previously served on both the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council. Colonel Leighton, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
You bet, Dan. Absolutely.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.